everyone. Miss Carol here. Thanks for joining me as we continue to talk about the first king of Israel, who was King Saul, as you know. If you remember from last week, David has been running from Saul for years now. And that was after God had already had Samuel anoint David to be the next king, but it doesn't seem like that's ever going to happen for David, because King Saul's chasing after him, trying to kill him, isn't he? And many times David could have killed Saul, but he refused. Do you remember what he said? He said, "I will never kill the Lord's anointed king. That's up to the Lord when King Saul will die, whether he dies because he's old, whether he dies because he is sick, or whether he dies because God kills him, or he dies in a battle. Those are all up to God. It's not up to me to kill the king." So he refused, and he just kept running, didn't he? So now we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 4 and 5. And if you remember that quite a few years ago, the Spirit of God had left Saul and had gone into David. And Saul knows God's not with him anymore, and he knows he's going to lose his kingdom. And now we read that the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He asked the Lord about the battle, but the Lord did not answer him. And now King Saul faces his great enemy with a lot of armies gathered together, and he's worried. He's worried, what's going to happen to me? And God's not giving him an answer, and so that makes him even more afraid. Now, in chapter 31, we find out what happens during this battle. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites ran before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers, now that's the soldiers with the bow and arrows, when the archers took him over, they wounded him critically with arrows. In other words, he's not going to live from this. He's been struck by the arrows. He's not going to live. He's not dead, but he's not going to live. But 3 of his sons are dead, Jonathan being one of them. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me with your sword, or these Philistines will come and they will kill me, but they will abuse me first." But his armor-bearer was terrified to kill the king, and he would not do it. So Saul took his own sword, and he fell on the sword. And when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he took his own sword, and he died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. And when the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had run away and that Saul and his sons had died, they left their towns and they ran away. And the Philistines came and took over their towns. Wow. That's a terrible way to end that story, isn't it? So now not only did they lose the battle, but Saul and his sons are now dead. And the Israelites have lost some of their towns. They got scared, they ran away, and now the Philistines have taken over some of their towns. So now we begin in 2 Samuel. We're going to start with verse 1. After the death of Saul, a man arrived at David's camp, and his clothes were all torn with dust on his head. And when he came to David, he fell down to the ground to pay David honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. "I have escaped from the Israelite camp," he said. "Why, what happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "Oh, the Israelites ran from the battle," he said. "Many of them fell and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead as well." Then David said to the young man who brought them the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And he said, "Well, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa at the time, and there was Saul, and he was leaning on his spear. And the chariots, the Philistines' chariots and their drivers were chasing after him. And when he turned around and saw me, he called out to me. 'What can I do?' I said, and he said, 'Who are you?' I said, 'I am an Amalekite.' Then he said to me, 'Well, stand here by me and kill me. I'm almost dead, but I'm still alive. I don't want them to capture me alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen on his sword, he could not live. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for all the nation of Israel who had died by the sword that day. So David now knows Saul is indeed dead. He has died in a battle, and now he has no idea what's going to happen next. So the Bible tells us, though, that as people were running away from their homes and from their towns for fear of the Philistines, that word came to Saul's family that Saul and his sons were dead. And the Bible tells us that Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth. He was 5 years old when his dad was killed in that battle. And the woman that took care of him, called his nurse or his nanny, we might call her today, she was afraid that the Philistines would come and try to kill Mephibosheth too, because now he's next in line to the throne, isn't he? He was Jonathan's son. Jonathan was a prince. So she picks him up, or she starts running with him, I should say, and he falls, and now he is disabled. He can't walk alone anymore because he's badly, badly hurt. But she manages to get him away from danger. So the Bible tells us that after a time, that David asked the Lord, "Should I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go up." And he said, "Where shall I go?" And the Lord said, "Go up to Hebron." And so David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and in its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. When David was told that the men from Jabesh Gilead had been the ones who had buried Saul and his sons, he sent messengers to them saying, "The Lord bless you for showing kindness to Saul your master by burying him." All right, so now Saul has been made king, but not by all of Israel, just by the tribe of Judah. And that's because there was still a son left of Saul who fought to become the next king, even though he knew David was supposed to. He still fought, and others opposed David from becoming king, so they didn't stand by him either. But eventually we learn that after those men died that were trying to fight for the right to become king, we find in 2 Samuel chapter 5, starting with verse 1. And this was 7.5 years later. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your flesh and blood. In the past, while David was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military battles. And the Lord said to you, 'You will take care of my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.' And when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed him king over all of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned just over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And then in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. And we find out that David leaves Hebron and he gets the city of Jerusalem back from the enemy. And David then moved to Jerusalem, and it was called the City of David. And he built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and David became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. And now Hiram, who was king of a country called Tyre, sent men to David with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and he had them build a palace for David. And then David knew that the Lord truly had made him king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now, David truly feels like he's finally king, but it was a long time to get there, wasn't it? But goodness, he didn't give up, at least. Now, David, as he's king now, and now he lives in a beautiful cedar palace in Jerusalem. And he remembers that the Ark of the Covenant was still, you remember in that place, Jareth-Gilead, I'm saying that right. That's where the Philistines, you remember, they put the ark. It brought them so much bad luck after they stole it that they put it on that cart and sent it off back to Israel. Well, it was still there at that threshing floor. So David says, that's not right. I need to go get it. And so he gathers the people together and he makes a decision. We're going to go get that ark. We're going to bring it here to Jerusalem. It should be in Jerusalem. It shouldn't be out there all sitting in a field somewhere. And so they gather the people together. It's on that cart, where they had sent it, right? So it's on the cart. So they're going through the towns and everyone is cheering. They're so happy. Here comes the ark. But there's something wrong with the way they're bringing that ark in. And if you remember, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So let's just listen to the story. So David and all his men went to bring up the ark of God, which is called by the name of God, the name of the Lord God Almighty, who sits between the cherubim on the ark. And they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house which was on the hill. And Abinadab, who was a relative of Eleazar the high priest, and his two sons, Uzzah and Ahio, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. And David and all of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen stumbled. He thought the ark was going to fall out of the cart. But when he touched the ark of the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and he killed him and struck him down right there. And David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "Then how can I ever bring the ark of the Lord to Jerusalem?" So he wasn't willing to move it again. And he waited 3 months until he found out that the man Nacon, his house was being blessed by having the ark there. And he thought 3 months later, I'm going to try to bring it again. But I'm going to find out from the Levites, how were we supposed to carry the ark? Do you remember how the ark was supposed to be carried? Do you remember that? Do you see the 2 poles coming out from the ark here? Do you remember what those poles were supposed to be for? Remember, the priest, only the Levites could carry the ark, and they would carry it with a pole on their shoulder. They weren't supposed to put it in a cart. They weren't supposed to touch it all. They were just supposed to carry the poles. Once he found out the right way to bring the ark, he goes back and he gets the ark. And this time he does it the right way, with the priests carrying the ark on their shoulders. That's how it should have been brought in. Now, the tabernacle was not there in Jerusalem. There was no place to put the ark, so David set up a tent. And they set the ark of the Lord in the tent, and they all worshiped the Lord. But he was so happy to finally have the ark back again. And in 1 Samuel chapter 9, after David has been king for a while, he thinks about his good friend Jonathan and the promise they made to each other to take care of anybody of their family if anything ever happened to them. And he thought, does Jonathan have any family? Should I have been taking care of them? So he asked, is there anyone still alive in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for my friend Jonathan? And now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba, and they called him to appear before David. And the king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Now we know there is, don't we? Mephibosheth, right? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is disabled. He can't walk alone. He's disabled in both feet. Where is he? Oh, he's staying in the house of Machir. So David had him brought before him. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will give you back all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table here in the palace. And King Saul and Mephibosheth said, why would you do that for me, King David? Why would you do that for me? And he said, I want you to be here, and I want you to live here in Jerusalem with me, and I want you to always eat at my table like one of my own sons. And he always stayed with David because he was disabled. So David finally remembers his promise, doesn't he, that he and Jonathan made to take care of anybody that was left in their families. So he honors that promise. David's finally king, isn't he? Well, let's see what happens next week. I've got 2 sheets for you, a worksheet here and a word search there. I'm excited to continue our story, find out what happens as we continue with David and see what happens next as we continue with the kings. I love you. I miss you. Be the very best that you can be. Bye-bye.